Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith, and this week we're going to build a data-driven Gantt chart using data from the Monday.com API. So Monday's API is GraphQL based. We'll be covering some basics about GraphQL and how to use it in Appsmith. Then we'll be transforming that data using JavaScript to put it into the right format for MermaidJS. And then lastly, we'll go over some details about Mermaid, how to use it in an iframe widget, and how to pass in data dynamically. So let's get started. First, we'll check out the Monday.com API playground and build our query before we pull it into Appsmith. All right, let's check it out. All right, here's a quick preview of what we're going to build. This is MermaidJS running in an iframe, and I'm pulling in data from the Monday.com GraphQL API. Now, Monday already has a Gantt chart built in, but it's only on their free version, and if you want to upgrade for that, it's a per user cost. So if you already have 10, 20, whatever, 50 people using your free version, that's a huge jump in cost to upgrade just for that one feature. So if you're in that situation or you just want to add a Gantt chart to any other platform, this will work with any API, any database, any one of our data sources. You could use the same approach and pull in data from that third-party API or database, transform it with a little JavaScript, and then display it in an iframe widget like this with MermaidJS. So let's look at, let's pull up the Mermaid docs here as well. And so you can see they have a bunch of different chart types that all use a markdown-like syntax. It's not exactly markdown, but it is plain text. It's human readable. And so there's just these kind of structured formats that are expected. And if you've got the right, uh, declaration at the top for the chart type, and then these lines match that chart type, then it'll just render whatever you put in there as long as you give it a class of mermaid. So you put it inside of a div or whatever element and add the class of mermaid, import the library, and then it'll display whatever chart type. So let's look at the Gantt chart. And you can see the format here that's required. It's just a title and then a date for each one, and you tell it what the date format is. So it's flexible. You can give it the data in the format that your dates are stored. You just tell it what that format is. And then there's this duration. There's a few different ways you can insert it. You can give it a start date and then say 12 days. You can just have duration by itself. So they have a few examples here, but what we're going to do is using a start and end date specifically instead of the duration. So we'll go through the data from Monday.com, through the API data here, and grab that task name and then the start and end date, and just build up a string in that same format so that we can insert it into an iframe. You could also use a custom widget. You can get a lot more features and functionality with a custom widget, but I want to keep this example simple because it also involves GraphQL and some JavaScript to transform it. And just to kind of minimize how many new things we're throwing at you here, we're going to start out with just working in Monday.com to replicate the query. And once we got that data, then we can pull it into Appsmith and then get a basic chart working and then make it dynamic and put that query response into the chart. So first thing, we'll start out with the Monday.com API playground. And this is a GraphQL kind of editor. We can build your query here. There's built-in docs. So you can look through here and find all the different endpoints and format, what fields you can filter on, all that type of stuff is in here. So let's collapse that here and just look at this default query that it is loading up here when I first opened the API playground. And so it's working, it's pulling data from my account. But it's not quite the data that I need for this board to plot the dates. So you can see that I'm getting some columns here. It's telling me like what columns are in it. This is more of the schema as opposed to actual records. So I have a query written already that'll get you pretty close for a project board in Monday. depending on what table you're trying to chart, and if it's Monday or you're using some other API, then this first step might be a little different for you. But just to make this easy, I've got it already typed out on this tutorial here. So you'll want to copy this query to get a board given its ID, and then get all of the items on that board, which is going to include the start and end dates. The format's a little weird, but you'll see it here in a minute when we run the query. So I'm going to copy this into here, and I'm using a variable for the board ID, but I'm going to try it without putting the variable down here because I think the GraphQL errors are pretty helpful actually. If you just try stuff and run it, it'll tell you what you're missing. So I ran that with declaring this variable board ID, but I didn't actually give it an ID, and it's still come back with something, which is pretty weird. I guess it's given me all of them. Boards, and that's an array. Okay, now here's another object. Yeah, so it's just giving me all of them because I didn't give it a value. So I'm going to come back here to my tutorial and copy this board ID object, and it expects it in an array because you could do more than one. So right here, I need a board ID, and I'm going to grab that from right here. So from the URL of this board, it's just right after board slash, and we will put that here into the variable. And now notice how this last response is a data object, and then boards, which is an array, and there's multiple. So I'm going to run it again. And now we have a board array, but there's only that one object. So you want to get close, get your query at least pretty close to what you want. If you need to add a column or tweak it or whatever in Appsmith, that's fine. But the autocomplete, the docs built in, just this whole experience for building the query is going to be a lot easier to use here where you're authenticated and you don't have to worry about an API key yet. So I would just recommend building your query here, get something working, and then once you're getting back the task name and you've got those dates and stuff that are going to be needed, now we can move on and replicate this in Appsmith and start transforming it for a mermaid chart. So we're going to leave this here, the query and the variable, and go to My Access Tokens, and then you'll click Show Token to copy it. You can also regenerate because you don't want to allow this to get exposed, and if it does, you can just regenerate it, and that'll invalidate the last one. So you'll want to come here and copy that token, and then we're going to create a data source in Appsmith to save that key. Now, I already have one set up, but I just want to show you where you can show and copy the key. And then come over to Appsmith and go to the data side. Click the plus here to create a new data source and choose Authenticated GraphQL API. So there's two GraphQL. The first one's kind of like Postman where you're just going to enter it directly and have the key right there in the field. But if you set up a authenticated API first, either REST for the regular API or GraphQL here, then you can save those credentials on the Appsmith server and it'll separate it from your app. You won't have that token stored in your app definition anymore, which is really important if you connect your app to Git, because then it's going to put that into a repo. And if you have the repo public, that could expose your key. So set up your data source first. You'll use the URL for, it's going to be the same URL actually in the API for like all the queries, but your project is going to have your own domain. So like when you are accessing it on the website, there's that prefix that's specific to your company, but the GraphQL API, it's all the same. So you set up those variables, fill out the details there for the API, and got that here in the tutorial as well. So here's the root URL. Select bearer token and then put in that token and save it. And that's the only part I'm kind of skipping past here because I already got a data source set up, and then that way I don't have to try to blur out my key or delete it later. So just come here and save that data source. And then once you have it, then you can add APIs underneath that data source. So I can go to that Monday GraphQL API here, the data source that I created, and add a new API. And that will create one that inherits those credentials. So I already have my data source set up. I'm going to start a new blank page. All right, and now we'll add an API under that GraphQL data source. And I'll just call this get tasks. And then for the query body, we'll copy the query that we wrote over here. And same for the variables. So then below that here, we've got the input for the query variables. Okay, so we'll go ahead and run this. And we got back a board array with a single object. Okay, that looks right. So we have the raw data that is needed now, and it still needs to be transformed for Mermaid, but we're gonna set this aside for a minute and get a iframe set up using Mermaid, and we'll just use the static Gantt chart from their example here. But once that's working, then we can swap out the data. So next step is we will go to the UI tab here and drag in an iframe widget. All right. With a iframe, you can have this URL or the actual HTML here, the source doc, and this will act as a fallback value or a default if you don't have anything in here. So you can actually have both. Now, I'm going to start with the snippet that I have here in the tutorial. This is pretty similar to what's in their API docs. Um, I just got rid of like the head and the body and the stuff that you don't need for an iframe widget. So it's really just one line to import the script and a div with some valid Mermaid code in it. So let's copy all this and put it into this source doc field here. All right, and as you can see, it showed as plain text for a second, and then the script imported and it initialized Mermaid. And once that ran, it re-rendered with those tasks and just created this Gantt chart from this raw data from the text here. So if we can swap out this chunk right here with data that matches the data from GraphQL from Monday.com, then this will be a live chart fed from the API. So the last step here to connect the two, we need a function in between, a JavaScript function to map over the response data from this API. And let's take a closer look at this. There's that boards array inside the object, which is a board. There's items, and then that's an array. And we collapse this. So that's it. Items is the real thing we're looking for. And it's actually, I think, one level deeper, column values, item values, or items and then column values. And so we got to find the ones that say project timeline to get the start and end date, and then just the title. And so we're going to loop through these, extracting certain data points here to build up that string. So let's go to the JS tab and create a new JS object. And then back to the tutorial here, just to save some typing. I've got a function for this already. It's pretty simple, but I don't want to type it out one character at a time here and try to explain it at the same time. So this is a named function here. And then we're passing in a tasks array. And I'm just drilling down to that .data. So every API has a .data. And then depending on the API, they might also wrap it in another object called data. That's why there's two. Appsmith has its own for every single API. This one has its own. And then inside there, we go to boards. The first record, since we're only getting back one board, it's going to be the first one. And then drill down to the item page items, okay? So we are passing in that array as the default, and then just getting the first line. So let's look at Mermaid again. We need the word Gantt, and then a line saying what that format is, and then another line return, and then we get into the actual data. So what this function does is it defines that first line, and then for each task, it goes through the full array and just extract the name, and then find the column that has the project timeline, so you can get the start and end date, find the column that's got the status and pull that out. And then once you got those three things, here I'm just making sure it's valid, that one of those wasn't undefined, because the chart will break if each line isn't a valid start and end. And so once I've got the data, then I can just destructured here and splitting it because there's a start and end date. Let's look at the response again. Yeah, this is what we're splitting here. So it's coming back with the start and end date, and it's separated by a space, hyphen, and a space. So if you look at my split, I'm including the spaces so that they get removed. I'm splitting it by that, and then what's left over is just the dates. Okay, and then once I've got the dates, then I just create that line, plus equals, so I'm adding onto this string, and the end result is just in that format. It's just a big string concatenated with the right data points. So we can take this output and put it right here. So we're just going to replace what's inside this div with double curly braces and then reference JS object 1 and grab that function, and there we go. Now, the last piece of this, you'll see that the text almost overlaps here. You can barely read the dates. So depending on the size of your app, I'm zoomed in a lot just because I do that when I'm recording. But it doesn't look bad at a normal zoom, at a normal app width. That's just part of me having it way zoomed in here. So here you go. That's pretty easy to read. It actually looks decent. It's just I always zoom way in for these. So this is pretty easy to set up. Mermaid itself is really easy to use. You just import that library, have a div with a class of Mermaid, and then put your data in that format. Now, if you're doing this for your docs to create a chart or something, probably wouldn't do a Gantt chart, but the state diagrams and things like this. If you're doing that for docs or just to explain something, it's fine if you got to click in here and manually type and edit this once. But if it's something repeated, if you want to like see an updated chart, right? The trick is always transforming your data into the right format to make these things data driven. The library itself is easy to use. The format that you need is easy to understand. So the trick is just like looking at your source format, what's the end goal, and then writing some JavaScript in between to transform it. And once you get that part down, you can take data from pretty much any API or database and create any chart type. So I hope this has been helpful. That's all I want to go over for this week. If you have any questions on this one or ideas for future workshops, feel free to drop a comment below. So thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.